Over the 3 years of running this channel, I've reviewed a decent amount of games, and I've reviewed a couple movies, so I figured, why not review a book too? And what better choice than a book that's based off the game I started this channel for? Kazushige Nojima is a name that should hopefully be familiar to any Final Fantasy fan worth their salt, because chances are he was the lead writer for one of their favorite entries, such as Final Fantasy VII, 8, 10, 10-2, 13, and also spin-offs and games adjacent to Final Fantasy, such as Kingdom Hearts 1, Chain of Memories, and 2. But he should definitely be familiar to anyone who keeps up with compilation of Final Fantasy VII content, because he's basically the brains behind the whole operation. He wrote Advent Children, Before Crisis, Crisis Core, Remake, and the upcoming Ever Crisis and Rebirth. He actually did not write Dirge of Cerberus, which probably explains a few things. But his contributions to the compilation aren't limited to just games and a movie. He's also made a few novels too, such as On the Way to a Smile and The Kids Are All Right, a Turk's side story. Nojima is basically a walking compendium of every world-building detail relevant to the world of Final Fantasy VII. Damn near everything you love or hate about the compilation's writing came from this man's brain, and he's still going. With Ever Crisis and Rebirth still being a ways off, the most recent addition to the remake continuity is Traces of Two Pasts, an anthology, so to speak, that focuses on the two main heroines, Tifa and Aerith, and the sections of their lives that are set before the beginning of the game. In Tifa's section, the story goes from her childhood at about 7 years of age, all the way to when she gains ownership of Seventh Heaven, meets Barrett, and joins Avalanche. In Aerith's section, the story goes from just prior to her escape from Shinra with her biological mother, Ifalna, all the way to just before meeting Zack. So you won't be able to hear her perspective on things about him. Disappointing, I know, but I understand the exclusion when Crisis Core Reunion exists, and it would probably break the narrative a bit for Aerith to even mention Zack to Tifa at this point. What makes these stories interesting is that, even though they're told in the third person, they are memories being recalled by the respective character during events of the ongoing remake narrative. That probably sounds a little confusing, so let me give an example. I should add that this might kinda sorta be considered minor spoilers, depending on how you look at it, but it's not a detail that means much to the actual memories. During Tifa's section, she is telling the story of her past to the other members of the party, Aerith, Red 13, Barrett, and Cloud, after departing Calm, which means she's telling the story after the huge flashback sequence of Cloud recalling his time as a soldier in Nibelheim, and Aerith recalls her own past while the party is dressed up as Shinra troopers on the cargo ship going from Junon to Costa del Sol. It's a pretty interesting detail that makes me wonder if we will catch glimpses of either character telling these stories in Rebirth. Nojima's writing style is easy to read, and in a good way. Descriptions of people, places, and actions make sense, and the prose usually isn't particularly flowery until the situation calls for it, often in relation to how the protagonist perceives whatever is being described. The pace goes back and forth between being rather deliberate and fairly quick, because each story covers a space of several years, and not every period of either girl's life is worth going into detail about, so there are moments where weeks, months, or even a whole year is just glossed over, which is obviously to be expected. It's also worth mentioning that the excellent readability of this novel is also thanks in part to the great translation. In this case, the translator is Stephen Kohler, who also translated the Final Fantasy XV novel Dawn of the Future. As I read through the book, I couldn't help but notice how good of a decision it was for Nojima to specifically pick Tifa and Aerith as the main subjects for a novel covering events before the beginning of the game. It took until this book for me to truly realize how many threads these two girls have to other things around them that contribute to the world building of this setting. Not only is Tifa tied to major events like Nibelheim, but her story also goes into painstaking detail about slum life as well as parts of Avalanche and how they operate. Aerith's story goes into less detail overall, but it zooms in a lot on Elmira, who she is and why the hell she has such a nice house. It also touches on how Shinra operates, the Sector 5 orphanage, and Ifalna herself. It even goes over Aerith's powers as an ancient and how they fluctuate or weaken over time. Personally, I'm at a point where I don't think every single moment of a main character's life needs to be committed to any type of media. But in this case, there's practically an entire chasm of time between the Nibelheim incident, or especially Elmira adopting Aerith, and the actual beginning of the game. It should come as no surprise to anyone that either Tifa or Aerith had to endure their own fair share of hardships within that time. Especially Tifa, who basically lost everything in a single day and woke up hundreds of miles from home and had to just deal with it. And in Aerith's case, obviously her relationship with Elmira isn't always hunky-dory, nor the fact that she had to live under constant fear of being snatched up by Shinra again. All of these things were somewhat implied in the game, but now we have a canonical piece of media that actually goes into detail, because those were the years that more or less shaped these two into the characters we know and love. What I haven't mentioned just yet is the third story in the book after Tifa and Aerith sections. It's called Picturing the Past. It's a short story told in first person about a Midgar man who works for Shinra performing his own investigation on a missing friend, hoping to tie up a loose end in his life before he begins his own as a new father. It's a brief but surprisingly gripping read that just drives the point home further that there are much more people inhabiting this world than the heroes we're most familiar with. Franchises with extended universes always try to reincorporate the most famous characters as much as possible, even if it doesn't suit the story that much. Star Wars has been pretty guilty of this throughout the last few years of the Skywalker era, so it's nice to receive a story that centers on an almost entirely new cast, especially to showcase more of how Shinra's actions harm the common people. Picturing the Past is a great look into the deeper depths of how the company operates, specifically in regard to its scientific operations in the search for the Promised Land. While I enjoyed it quite a bit, Traces of Two Pasts is not without its faults. First and foremost, it is not for just anyone to jump into. If there's one weakness worth mentioning, and I guess it's not really a weakness so much as it is just an inherent trait to a book like this, it's the fact that this is strictly complementary material. It is for people who have already been introduced to this world through Final Fantasy VII Remake, at the very least. Not that I would expect anyone to just blindly grab it without knowing what Final Fantasy VII is, but so much of the world's implicit details are going to go over the heads of any poor bastard who does grab it blindly. The actual narratives at large might be digestible, but the finer things will not be. At all. If there's one complaint I might have that might be considered significant, I suppose it would be the scope of Aerith's story. It doesn't feel like it covers as much ground as Tifa's. This might be because Tifa's story is objectively greater in scope because of the fact that she used to live in Nibelheim, experienced the incident, and was relocated to Midgar, but Aerith's story feels much more laser-focused on her and Elmira and less on the people around them compared to Tifa's. I would have liked a bit more information and fleshing out of Aerith's relationship with, say, the Turks. Some other very minor criticisms I have are directed at very specific things coming off as rather far-fetched, even for such a fantastical setting. Like Tifa becoming a martial arts master despite having very few opportunities for practical application and going years without seeing her teacher, Zangen. I understand he made Tifa his student because she's naturally gifted, but her journey into becoming such a powerhouse was extremely sparse in actual combat encounters, and instead focused almost exclusively on her doing exercises alone. It's not a huge problem though, I can ultimately still accept it as her being talented. And then you have occasions where dialogue comes off as pretty wooden. Nojima's writing style is so straightforward, it doesn't always allow much personality to come through spoken lines. When I imagine the voice actors for Tifa and Aerith speaking some of this dialogue, it doesn't always match the delivery or demeanor I heard from them in Remake. It just goes to show how important voice direction is in the actual video game. Overall, Traces of Two Paths is a great read for anyone who truly loves the world of Final Fantasy VII. It is not, by any means, a mandatory read from what I could tell of its contents, but it could be an important one for those who simply want more backstory and world building. It does a good job of making you feel more connected to Tifa and Aerith because you have a much better understanding of the hardships they dealt with while growing up beyond just what the game mentions. This book expands on not only their characterization, but everything related to that, including their relationships with other key characters. So if you are really deeply interested in more world building and backstory for Final Fantasy VII Remake, do yourself a favor and pick this book up. And now that the review is over, I want to dive into actual spoiler territory by briefly touching on a few specific parts of the book. Again, these are real spoilers, so if you don't want to hear them, feel free to exit the video now. First, Tifa section. I was pretty surprised at how often Nojima goes out of his way to clear up her relationship with Cloud as kids in Nibelheim. He makes it pretty clear that she is, in fact, in love with him, and sort of puts him on a pedestal like the other boys in the village did to her. And to add to that, Nojima is quite blunt in stating that her friendship with the other boys changed for the worse when they hit puberty. They went from being regular kids to 3 boys constantly trying to win the affection of the only girl in Nibelheim that was their age. But of course, their attempts at courtship were not successful because she only ever had her eyes on Cloud, whether she realized it or not. Furthermore, the book in general spared no effort in reminding the reader how insanely attractive both Tifa and Aerith are, as if we weren't already aware. Tifa in particular got the worst of it because she was constantly put in positions where her physical attractiveness was used by others for their own benefit. For Aerith's section, I was pleasantly surprised at how much Ifalna was present, though that still does not mean she was there for long. But man, Nojima went out of his way to make her time spent at Shinra sound like hell. Anyone who played either the original game or remake knows she suffered through terrible experiments as the only full-blooded ancient. But the book makes this even more horrible by adding the fact that she develops an opiate addiction because it was the only thing that eased her pain. Really rough. I mentioned earlier that the dialogue isn't terribly good at bringing out characters' personalities sometimes, but 2 characters that this definitely doesn't apply to are Jessie and Barrett. You can absolutely still tell when it's those 2 speaking, because Jessie is still very much a theater girl, and Barrett is still very much sailor-mouthed. And I guess that's pretty much everything that really pops into my mind right off the cuff, so I'll leave it here before I end up summarizing the whole damn book. This concludes my review of Traces of Two Paths. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.